Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about finding the line between sensual versus sexual and how that can sometimes be challenging for aces. A little while back, I made a video about finding the line between platonic versus romantic and how that can be challenging for aros. So with Ace Week 2024 kicking off, I wanted to make this video as an ace counterpart to that one. And before I dive in, I want to give a warning that this video might not be safe for work because I will be talking about sex. The subject matter kind of necessitates it. It'll be framed from a sex education perspective, but still. There will also be a few brief mentions of non-consensual sex. And if any of that means this video is not for you, I have a whole bunch of other ones you can check out instead. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started with a basic understanding of sensual versus sexual. At a bare bones level, sensual means related to the senses, particularly the sense of touch in this context, and sexual means related to sex. In the framework of the split attraction model, sensual attraction means the urge or desire to be physically close to someone and touch them, while sexual attraction is described as the urge or desire to have sex with someone. So when it comes to action, because as we all know, action does not equal attraction, some examples of sensual behavior might include things like hugging or holding hands, while some examples of sexual behavior might include things like intercourse or genital stimulation. Now, what makes it tricky to find where sensual ends and sexual begins is that there's a ton of overlap between them. And on top of that, there are a lot of different, sometimes conflicting opinions on what counts as sex. In a medical context, anything that might affect your sexual health by resulting in things like pregnancy or a sexually transmitted infection counts as sex. But in a personal or cultural context, it varies. Some people count anything that involves the genitals, some people count anything that involves an orgasm, some people count anything that involves penetration, and some people only count anything that could lead to pregnancy. In the southern US Bible Belt brand of purity culture I grew up in, I've actually heard people call themselves virgins even after having anal intercourse because you can't get pregnant that way, which is wild to me. It's also worth noting here that if you try to draw a hard line around what counts as sex, there are always going to be some exceptions or things that don't quite fit. For example, if we use the medical standard of anything that could impact your sexual health counts as sex, then that would include sexual assault, which I know a lot of people, myself included, don't count in their personal definitions of sex. They only count consensual sexual behavior. And on the other hand, the medical standard of what counts as sex wouldn't include things like dry humping or mutual masturbation or phone sex, because those things don't involve direct contact with another person's genitals and can't get you pregnant or give you an STI. But plenty of people do count all of those things as sex, and plenty of people also don't. There are even people who don't count direct forms of genital stimulation like manual or oral as sex because those things are just foreplay. So as you can see, there's really no winning here. And if it's that difficult to agree on what counts as sex, you can probably tell why it's also difficult to find the line between sensual versus sexual. In ace community spaces online, I've seen so many posts where people say things like, okay, I get what the split attraction model is, but what counts as sensual attraction and what counts as sexual attraction? And in the discussions that follow, there's never 100% consensus. There are two particular behaviors that seem to fall in a big gray area between sensual versus sexual in all of these discussions, and those are kissing and kink. So I want to dig into each of those a little bit more, and I'll start with kissing because that was the first thing that made me realize there was such a lack of a clear-cut line between sensual and sexual. I remember when I was questioning my orientation, thinking I might be ace, reading tons of posts from aces on social media, and seeing lots of them say that they could never kiss anyone because that was way too sexual. And I was thinking, huh? Kissing is sexual? Since when? Because for me, kissing always fell very firmly into sensual territory. It was never sexual at all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that kissing actually can be sexual. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. It depends on the person and the situation. If you're kissing someone to communicate your sexual attraction to them, or if you want kissing to lead to more, then yes, that could totally count as sexual. In fact, when I look back at my own limited experience with kissing, the moment when it would always stop being fun and start feeling boring to me was when I could tell my partner had some kind of sexual intent behind it. I've seen some aces try to make designations like kissing someone on the cheek or the forehead isn't sexual, but kissing someone on the mouth is. Or kissing someone on the mouth isn't sexual, but French kissing is. Or French kissing isn't sexual until you start grabbing breasts and butts and dry humping, and then it is. But just like with the question of what counts as sex, there's never 100% consensus around kissing either. And it's the exact same way with kink. I feel like kink gets even more hotly debated than kissing, and I have a whole other video about whether kink at Pride is disrespectful to aces if you want to check that out. But in this video, I want to focus on how kink falls into that same kind of gray area between sensual and sexual that kissing does. Many people believe that kink is inherently sexual, but any kinky person, especially a kinky asexual person, can tell you that it's not. Just like kissing, it can be sexual, but it doesn't have to be. At its core, kink isn't about sex, it's about dynamics. And those dynamics can come into play sensually or sexually or both, or neither if they're only explored mentally but not physically. Kinks that are rooted in physical sensations like bondage, impact play, temperature play, etc., are by nature sensual experiences. One kink that's especially sensual is sensory deprivation, like blindfolding someone or plugging their ears, because taking away one or more senses is designed to heighten the rest. These kinds of kinks might be sexual too if the physical sensations are used to stimulate someone's genitals or spark their arousal or bring them to orgasm, but they also don't have to involve any of that. They could just be sensual experiences that aren't sexual at all. Kinks that are rooted less in physical sensations and more on the emotional side of dynamics, like praise, humiliation, dominance and submission, other forms of power play, etc., aren't sensual or sexual by nature, but they can be as sensual and or sexual as you want them to be. What I find most fascinating about kink is that people participating in the same kink with each other can experience it in entirely different ways. Let's say you don't find rope bondage sexual at all, but your partner does. Tying them up might be a sensual only experience for you, but both a sensual and sexual experience for them. And that has some really cool implications for aces who worry that it might be harder to find a partner based on sexual compatibility. Kink could be a great way to bridge those kinds of compatibility gaps between ace and allo partners, or between ace partners with different degrees of sex favorability. When it comes to both kissing and kink, neither of those things are inherently sexual, but they can be if you have sexual intent behind them. And that's why I think it's so important to communicate your intent before you kiss someone or engage in kinky play with them to make sure that they're on the same page as you. Okay, we've established that kissing and kink fall into a gray area between sensual and sexual, and that there's not even consensus on what counts as sex. So when it comes to finding that line between sensual versus sexual, where does that leave us? I personally don't think that line exists, at least not at a social level. I think it can only exist at an individual level. I know where my line is between sensual versus sexual, but it's probably different from your line and everybody else's. And it wasn't even easy for me to figure out where my line is. After all, I am asexual and largely touch-averse. So sexual attraction is something I just don't feel, and sensual attraction is something I don't feel very often. And my experience with both sensual and sexual behavior is quite limited as a result. So it took a lot of questioning and exploring and listening to others' experiences to fully understand what counts as sensual and sexual for me. And that means that when we talk about things like the split attraction model, we have to keep in mind that even though we can come up with descriptions of sensual versus sexual and have some really interesting discussions about that in the context of asexuality, we can't actually draw a line between sensual versus sexual for anyone but ourselves. And that is where I want to wrap things up and turn the conversation over to you. Where is your line between sensual versus sexual? Is that something you found difficult to define, especially if you're on the asexual spectrum? How do you communicate with others about sensual and/or sexual behavior and your boundaries around them? And as always, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. Happy Ace Week, and I will see you on the next one.